Okie doke. Okay. So, um, when we jump in and start talking about adolescence, typically um, we have reactions to it in either good reactions to our own experience of adolescence or maybe negative or bad reactions to our own experience of adolescence. Um, and that's been my experience kind of working and teaching in this class. Some people actually have pretty good experiences through adolescence just because you go through adolescence and it's difficult, and obviously puberty is involved and there's changes to your body and your brain, and you're becoming more sexually active, or at least thinking about it more. Some people don't have a bad experience in adolescence. It's kind of one of those things where over the years we've, I say we, culturally speaking, it's been kind of, I don't know about demonized, but it's been seen as a negative process. And we kind of look at adolescence kind of negatively. And there's definitely reasons. Some people maybe did not have great experiences in adolescence, and they were really difficult, and they had trouble at home, or maybe they had trouble at school, or junior high is typically super, super awkward anyway. And some people really struggle those 6th, 7th, 8th grade years. And maybe in high school, they struggle a little bit. Maybe they end up, it's okay. But typically there's a little bit of a mixture of both. And so I was kind of curious about this. So, and I'm not going to make everyone talk. But a couple of things I would love if anyone wants to share just in general their adolescent experience. And I'm going to start. When I say share the experience, looking at it in two different buckets, right? The kind of the junior high bucket and the high school bucket. They're a little bit different. They can have some similarities, but they're a little bit different. And if anyone wants to share their experiences in those two areas, I'd love for that to happen. And I'll start. My parents got divorced when I was in 7th grade, like towards kind of the middle of 7th grade. So that really influenced a lot of the last year and a half of junior high for sure, and high school. And so that was really difficult, kind of a hard time for me, even though at the time I didn't see it as hard. At the same time, I really had a lot of really good friends at that point. And so that was super helpful. But the big thing that probably impacted me the most was I started dating like end of 8th grade into high school. And I just kind of kept doing that and just kind of lost myself in that process of dating. And at the expense of all of my academic work. I was actually a really good student through elementary and the first part of, through 6th grade, and then even pretty good in 7th grade. But after like eighth grade on through my senior year, I didn't really try that hard. I kind of left it. I didn't have a lot of motivation to do anything. And so focused on sports, friends, and girls. And that was my focus, which is not necessarily uncommon. But it did have, for me, some long-term effects on my life after high school. And so a lot of this stuff I didn't see till I look back. So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, my whole junior high and high school experience, if 10 is the best, like it's great, it was awesome, and 1 is like, oh, it's horrible, I'd say mine was probably in the middle, like a 5. Maybe some days it was an 8, but overall it was probably a 5, maybe a 6. But most of the time it was really, really hard, and I got in some really dark places. And so for me, looking back on adolescence, I don't think I would go back for anything. So would anyone else care to share just their experience? Again, you don't have to, but
I can
I'd
share.
love to hear. Yeah, great.
So this is Araceli Fuentes. So to give some precursor or history, so middle school was the hardest for me. I would never ever do middle school again. Like that would be my ultimate never, like just it would be just horrible for me. Like 8th grade was just so difficult for me and I struggled a lot. So going into high school was a different experience for me. So but what I think high school to me taught resiliency, but it's like I don't think I think I had I think it made me stronger. So when I was in, I was really strong in my faith in high school, but I was also extremely sheltered at the same time. But I just want to give a back history where I grew up. In California, where I grew up in a very predominantly very affluent. We're not affluent. I'm going to say by no means are we affluent, but we grew up in a very affluent society where, you know, if you got an SAT that was very high, but it was very college driven. Like, that was a very shock for me when I worked in the school system in Texas. That in California, where I like that people were very big on the California culture where I grew up is extremely big on college. Like if you don't, you were made fun of if you went to community college. Like it was a shame in your family. Like you were disrespected. So I was in special education, and so I purposely hid my textbooks from people because I didn't want people to know that I was in special education and that I was gonna not I was gonna go to community college. And so I got made fun. No one knew I was in special education. Like that was the interesting thing. But all my friends would assume I was gonna go to UCLA or one of the big colleges because I don't know, I guess a decent vocabulary. I don't know, or I just kept it very hidden, or I stole calculus books to look cool. Yeah, who steals calculus books to look cool? Apparently my school. And
Right.
so that was really difficult for me to like, I felt like that's I think where the imposter syndrome came from. But like the interesting thing is that it was that time I learned about self-advocacy. I learned about that my disability is also my strength, and that I
Mhm.
learned to play on different things. And I went to a school, I was transitioned very well into what I wanted to do in life. But, you know, I can't say the same for all schools, but, you know, I actually got to go to a youth leadership forum for people with disabilities, and was able to meet, at that time it was Arnold Schwarzenegger was our governor. So I got to
Yeah.
meet him and talk about like people with disabilities and how can you help them. And so, you know, that like, yeah, I was embarrassed about who I was. And I was ashamed of, you know, that I wasn't like everyone, that I wasn't going to go to a big fancy college. And then on top of that, like my first 2 years, I was really morbidly obese. Like I was really heavy and I talked with a lateral lisp. So I sounded like this. So I couldn't really say my name very well. So I got made fun of, and I had really curly frizzy hair. I had glasses, everything you can imagine, like from the movie Princess Diaries. I looked like that. I was just really goofy looking, and like, you know, guys didn't really look at me. So, but then like all of a sudden in my junior year, I lost a lot of weight. I learned how to flat iron my hair. I learned how to put on makeup. The glasses were gone. My contacts were in. And all of a sudden, I guess I got pretty. I don't know. Like I still struggle with that, but it was funny to me that like I had so many big monumentous moments in high school,
Yeah.
and like, you know, it really changed the trajectory of who I was as a person. But it was interesting to know that I got all this attention, and I was so socially awkward that I didn't know what to do with it. So I just started becoming more recluse, or I don't know. Like I just remember
Yeah.
my parents realizing that I all of a sudden became pretty overnight, and they're like, oh, we should like not have you talk to any men or any boys
Right.
for this matter. So, and then like, you know, that's where the start of MySpace came in, and that's where the start of like, you know, Facebook and like like messaging people. So like that really like opened many doors to connect with different people. But I don't know,
Yeah.
like that was my high school experience.
Yeah. I think you're hitting on Araceli. Thanks for sharing. And I think it's really good that we can share our stories because it's our story, and there's a lot of power in sharing our story. And you talked about a lot of things we're actually going to talk about. So I really appreciate it. And I think Donna, you'd raise your hand too.
Sure. Thanks for sharing, Adeseli. That's really awesome. I actually grew up in San Antonio, and I had rough high school because my parents moved us from a private school to a public school because we moved to the very north side of San Antonio, which was more affluent. But my parents expected all of us to go to college, and everybody around there, the same thing. Everybody went to college. I was involved in sports just like you, doctor, and that was good because I think it kept me out of more trouble than I could have gotten in. But even then, I struggled with, you know, the groups that wanted to go drinking. Other groups were more into drugs. It was affluent, and so there was a lot of money, and so a lot of kids could purchase drugs and stuff that other schools couldn't. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I guess anybody can get drugs now, but back then, that's just kind of the way it was. You had money, then you could get the drugs. So I just remember, and I grew up in a very Christian family, and I joined Fellowship of Christian Athletes, so that kept me pretty straight as far as not running too far off the path. But there was a lot of struggle during that time because I was just trying to figure out, who am I?
Mhm.
Am I want to be independent, but I believe in what my parents are telling me. But, that whole struggle of, I just want to be my own boss. But then, you go out and try and be your own boss, and then you fall on your face. And then you're like, oh, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. So there was a lot of that kind of struggling. Boyfriend things, probably getting a little bit more involved in sexual activity than I should have at that age, and not smart enough to even know that I should be using some contraception.
Yeah.
So that was a very dangerous time. My parents are still married. I think they're hitting 45 years this, no, if I'm 56, they're hitting 65 years of being married. That's to me unheard of. But anyway, even though I had a very strong, stable family, there was still all of the influences, all of the things coming at a teenager at that time.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
that's what I think.
And I'm glad you brought up this idea of identity, because that is a gargantuan piece of adolescence. Really, it really coming out of childhood. Because we've kind of talked about this idea of like how we, as kids, start seeing the world, and then they start to see themselves. And then once they start seeing themselves, they start seeing other people. And when we get into adolescence, then we're talking about like a couple of different questions that they're going to ask. So I really appreciate you talking about that. That's actually super helpful. And I know everyone could share great stories about it. And this is what I was saying. People either have strong negative feelings about adolescence, or strong positive ones, or maybe sometimes in between. But there's typically, there's a lot of things that are happening for us individually in adolescence. And so I want to talk about a couple of those things. So I'm going to share my screen, and these slides are on Moodle as well. If you guys ever wanted to look them up, it's exact same slides that I am sharing, hopefully, with everyone. I'm going to go ahead and okay. Make it a little bit bigger so we can kind of see it. There we go. Okay. And so keep in mind that I might go back and forth between slides, and I only tell you that because, if you want to follow along, it's probably great if you just grab those real quick off Moodle. And so just a couple of things that we're going to hit, obviously some biological changes. Araceli, you talked about this. We're going to talk about that really specifically. And there's either changes early on in adolescence, or maybe later on in adolescence, or sometimes kind of, progressively through adolescence. The new experiences that are happening, and also like developing these new developmental tasks that come along with adolescence. Some of those are social. Some of those are neurological. It depends on if you're taking harder classes, let's say, or something like that. But also the ethnic and the cultural influences on adolescence. We'll talk about that kind of towards the end. But these three questions that I wrote down, and these aren't the only questions that adolescents are kind of talking through or thinking about, but these are big ones for them. And so, who am I? Which is kind of what, Donna, you were kind of mentioning, like who is this person? Because you can see yourself changing physically, even like through the process. So like if you go back and you looked at pictures when you were in, I don't know, like 7th grade, and then you look in 12th grade, there's going to be some changes. So there's some physical changes, but also there's things that are happening inside that people don't see, right? The things going on in your brain that not everyone knows about, or the things that you're feeling that not everyone knows about, not just emotions, but just like a combination of thought and feeling. And you do start asking questions about like, okay, do people see me and do they like what they see? Right. So who am I? Do people see me and do they like what they see? And and there's variations of these questions, but in my experience, especially clinically speaking, we can be fairly certain that these questions are rattling around the brains of adolescents from 12, 13 all the way on, and maybe even into adulthood. Because if you form your identity in a certain way during adolescence, and then you want to change that identity, which we'll talk about next time. If you want to change some of that identity, which you can do, it's a little bit harder to do, but you can do it. But sometimes we take on multiple identities during adolescence, not just one. We might do 2 or 3 different kinds of identities. So these kind of questions are just kind of keep those in the back of your mind as we work through. And like I said, there's other questions. These are just some big ones, like some umbrella kind of questions that I always kind of think about as I've worked with adolescents through the years. And I would say, even though the culture, the environment, the atmosphere has definitely changed in our world for sure between, even in the last 15 years or 10 years or 20 years, it's definitely changed. Some of these questions really haven't changed as much, really. Still dealing with the same things, just in a different culture, different setting, different environment. And so we're going to kind of keep these kind of at the forefront as we go through. And so we'll talk about gender, socioeconomic status, age, lifestyle differences. Some of these things are all kind of like some of the influences that adolescents have in their life. So one of the big changes that happens is a lot of the social changes really start to happen in adolescence. And sometimes that happens early on in adolescence, depending on if they're, if a teenager is fairly extroverted, they might have some earlier social changes, but if they're introverted, it might take a little bit longer. And so we know that that's a big part of the process. One of the things that just from me working with adolescents as long as I have, when I first started back in the mid 90s, there was this book that came out called A Tribe Apart, written by a lady in the area I was living. I was living in Northern Virginia at the time. She wrote this book about her interactions with mainly high school students from one particular part of Northern Virginia. It was very fascinating. And some of the things that she pointed out, I thought was interesting, because she basically befriended a bunch of these kids and hung out with them, and then started noticing she didn't really start out to do it this way, but started noticing less and less adults in their life, which is not necessarily abnormal. That happens as teenagers get older. They want to be with their friends more than they want to be with adults. That's not necessarily weird. That happens. But what she started noticing is that they became their own tribe, and it was hard for adults to get in that tribe. And they were going through really, really, really difficult things together. And they were all going through it, trying to figure it out together, which is kind of a coin flip sometimes to see if they're going to make it through that or not. And so there started to be a little bit of research, probably in the mid 90s on. There's quite a bit more now. There started to be a lot more research into this idea of how teens can benefit from having really caring adults in their life, in addition to parents or guardians. And the reason I bring this up specifically is because I really kind of gravitated toward this idea early in my work with teens. And I see this to be extremely true, not just from my own experience, but the research really bears this out as well. It doesn't mean that the process of adolescence is any easier or anything like that. It just means if you have a village of teens that you kind of hang out with, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But if inside that village are also these caring adults that are around you, that are trusted by you and your parents or guardians, you have a better shot of making it through this kind of really kind of awkward, difficult process and getting on the other side of it, continuing to have those adult relationships. And so from my experience, what I started doing early on was, and this started in my student pastor days, I started having more adults involved in our programs, not less. And I tried to get as many different kinds of adults as I could find. Like we had the sporting adults that they did sports and they loved it and that was great. And I had 2 or 3 ladies that were knitters and sewers, and they joined our group, and there were kids that kind of gravitated towards them. We had adults that loved like video games and sci-fi, and they got kids gravitated towards them. And then just kind of, we had people in the middle, all kinds. And then we had some adults that didn't want to be involved in all, and that's fine. But in my experience, and this was really a helpful thing. And I'll take it back to what I also learned in my own growing up years that I didn't realize until I was probably in my 40s, that I actually had that experience in my own life in high school. Because as I was going through turmoil in my life, I had several adults that I would still consider friends today, even 30 years on, that were just there. They didn't push themselves on me. They didn't push any agendas. They were just there. And so one of the things that I will add to this, and we're going to talk about this more, is when you think about working with teenagers, one of the things you want to know is not just who their friends are. You definitely want to know that, because those friends are super influential. What other adults are in their life, and what other caring, trusted adults are in their life, because that's really important. And I'll just be honest, I've had mostly that conversation with their parents when I've worked with them, and I've asked them those questions specifically. And here's the reason why. If you can have enough really good caring adults in someone's life, that means that's that many more ears that they can have, because they need that sometimes. They need non-judgmental, very genuine listening ears. The non-judgmental part is the hardest part for parents. As a parent, when you listen to your children say things, it's really difficult for us to be very neutral and stand back and be non-judgmental, because we want to give advice. We don't want them to make a mistake that might hurt them, and we know that they might do that. I mean, we just have trouble with that. Versus other adults in their life that don't want bad things to happen, but it might be easier for them to kind of say things in a way that kids will understand. A great example of that, and everyone knows this example, and you can see it easily. A parent could tell their kid between the ages of 7 and 40 something over and over and over. Same thing over and over and over. And they will go and talk to one person and hear the exact same thing that their parents have been saying. And they'll come say, guess what they told me? This and this. And you're like, I've been saying this for 20 years. It has nothing to do with your influence. It's because they need to hear it from a different perspective. That's really, really important. And that's not just a teen thing. That's a human being thing. So my point is, and I know I'm kind of harping on this, there is a profound benefit of having caring adults in teenagers' lives, in addition to parents and guardians. Obviously, parents need to be involved in their life. And again, we're going to talk about some of those things too. Okay. Now let me pause for a second, because we're going to jump into puberty, and that's usually a big old cesspool of stuff. Does anybody have any question about what I'm saying right now? Does that make sense? Do you have any question about that? What do you think about that? Okay.
I'm sorry. I needed to unmute. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No problem.
No, I mean, I think I totally agree with you. I think, especially being on an educator side, I think where I teach at, I mean, I'm with the littles, but I have teacher friends that are teaching the older kids, and we have some of them, because they don't have those positive influences at home. A lot of times our teachers, and I still have some that I taught that have now gotten older, that they still come back. And I think you don't realize that sometimes they come because you are a safe place for them, and you can be a positive influence for them, because when they go home at night, they're not getting that parental guidance. Or maybe if they are, like you said, maybe if the parent is saying it over and over again, a lot of times they can come to the school and the teacher may say the very same thing, and they're like, well, I'm gonna listen to you.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's a great point, Marilyn. My first grade teacher follows me on Facebook and makes comments, and I talk to her all the time still, and which is great. I grew up in a little town, so everybody knew everybody. And like, I grew up in a town where it's basically like, if you did something wrong, everyone knew before you got home kind of place. So I had that. But the one thing I don't want us to do is we can fall into a trap when I start talking about this. We can easily fall into a trap, and I've done it. I fall into this trap of not bad mouthing parents, but kind of looking down on parents. Like, you're not listening to your kid, and you're doing this to your kid. Well, they're struggling too, right? They're having a hard time too. And so I want us to be able to keep that in mind, which we're going to talk about more here in a second. I wanted to talk about it first from kind of the adolescent standpoint, and then we're going to talk about it from this family parent standpoint, because both sides are not warring with each other, but going through huge changes at the same time, right? So I appreciate what you're saying, because you're right. I think when a person comes back to you after years and they talk to you like they've just known you all their life, you are a safe person. And that's what we're talking about, right? Being that safe person that they can talk to and kind of talk about. There's nothing more, there's almost no process in human development more awkward and difficult than puberty. Puberty is like an explosion of sex, an explosion of biological changes, an explosion of all kinds of emotions. And there's some that are very specific to males, and some very specific to females, for sure. I'm going to talk about it more broadly for the most part. And I'm going to talk about, like, biologically speaking, puberty most typically is not just about the physical maturation that you have, but it's also the hormonal and sexual kind of coming alive sexually as well. And so when we talk about it that way, I want to talk about it that way because that's extremely normal and natural for that to happen. And so there's going to be changes to your height, your weight, your skin, your hair, your thoughts, your feelings. I mean, all those things are going to happen. Pubic hair. I mean, those things can throw people off at times. And we don't talk about this most of the time, right? We don't, maybe they've had a class in school in 5th grade about something, potentially, they might do that. Texas, I think, does it in 5th grade. But at home, it's not necessarily talked about. And I grew up with a nurse, and she gave me a book. She's like, this is what's about to happen. She's very matter of fact. And that's made me very matter of fact. And I've always looked at it very kind of medically, but also like, hey, this is going to happen. So we started talking to our kids about sex probably, Kate's 15. So at least 5 or 6 years ago, we started talking about not just sex, but like changes in general. And of course, they all asked the questions when I was gone, and my wife had to start answering them. So when I got home, she like sicked them on me, and I had to talk to them, which is fine. And we're going to talk about kind of that sex talk here in a second, but all of these changes first start happening either early or later. So you're going to have some that are early matures and some that are late matures, and then some kind of in the middle. In terms of what, like timing, the age of a girl's first period has changed pretty drastically in the past few decades. It's not uncommon for even 9 or 10-year-old girls now to have their first period. That happens more often now. But typically speaking, they're going to have that between 9 and 15, roughly, on average. For boys, puberty on average will start between 10 and 13 and a half or 14, roughly. Some maybe a little earlier, some maybe a little later. But for boys, that hasn't changed a ton. But for girls, it's changed quite a bit, actually, in terms of timing.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What age did you say it is for boys now? That hasn't changed much?
So it's around 10 to 14, something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was writing the other notes and I missed
No,
it.
that's okay. That's okay. And again, this is all in the PowerPoints too. The reason why I bring this up is because Araceli, you kind of talked about this a little bit, talking about changes that happened to you in junior high versus high school, like as you got older. It's not uncommon for all of those changes to happen in weight, in height. And for boys, it affects boys different than girls to a certain extent, right? You know, if there's, and I don't know if I have it in this slide, I think I've got it later, but if a girl matures quicker, like early on in junior high, their self-esteem is typically a little higher versus if they develop later in high school, their self-esteem might not grow maybe until then. And so the same is not true for boys. It's actually the opposite. You can have boys that develop a little bit slower, but it doesn't affect their self-esteem as much. Probably that's a lot of body image, which we can talk about. There's a lot of body image discussions, and actually the body image discussion has changed significantly in the last 10 years to really include boys, which I think it should. And so anyway, puberty is just this explosion of so many things at once. And it's confusing to parents for sure, but it's extremely confusing to teenagers. And they're all going through it at the same time. It's also the second time in which we've talked about this before, the second time in our life where our brain is changing the most. The first is when we're born through infancy into toddlerhood, big changes. The second big changes are during adolescence. Some of those changes take 12, 13 years. Some of the changes won't stop in the prefrontal cortex until around age 25. So from around 12, 13, 14, all the way through 25 or so, you're going to have a lot of neurological changes. Okay. Which kind of makes it look like they're crazy. That's kind of where you get this crazy teen brain idea. And literally one day they're like awesome. And the next day they're like, depressed and upset and mad at everybody. And it's not uncommon for you to say, what's going on? And then for them to say, I don't know. And they're telling the truth because there's so many things happening at once. This is just something that happens. I want to talk about a couple of areas of the brain specifically. So the corpus callosum, where the fibers connect the left and right part of our brain, really start happening in adolescence, which is good. We need to connect those parts. Basically, if we didn't connect those parts, we would all be all emotion or all logic. At least we can have a little mixture of both. The amygdala, which is extremely powerful part of our brain. It's a little almond sliver looking part of the brain that sits right in the middle. Like if you drilled down right top of your head, right to the middle of your brain, kind of sits right in there, is the seat of emotions, right? So that whole limbic system kind of starts right there. And then of course the prefrontal cortex, which is exactly what it sounds. It's a prefrontal. It's involved in reasoning, decision-making, and self-control. But it's not going to reach full maturity for another 10 to 12 years, which is a lot of the reasons why teenagers think they're what? Invincible. And XYZ is not going to happen to me or whatever, right? The prefrontal is also a really important part in executive functioning, which is really concerns things like ADHD, when you have a little bit harder time setting goals or completing tasks or paying attention, that kind of thing. You already have struggle with that if your prefrontal is kind of developing later. Now it's going to develop, it just takes time. The last thing I'll talk about real quick, let me see if I've got, yeah, okay. And then I'm going to show a video, but the last thing I'm going to talk about real quick is what's called dendritic pruning. And by the way, all this stuff's in your book. So this is not, me, Chris, making this up. Dendritic pruning is kind of that personality change that kind of, like I was talking about, this crazy teenager syndrome we kind of see, because basically the connections that are happening in the brain, there's a bunch of them. And as we go through life, especially in adolescence, we're learning new skills, or we're developing new milestones, or we're thinking differently, or we're choosing differently. And so we start using more of those connections and sometimes less of those connections. And as we use those connections less, they're pruned, right? We don't use them as much, so they get pruned away. But the ones that we're using all the time, we strengthen them. We really strengthen them. This dendritic pruning is biological. It's also genetic, but it's also influenced by environment, really influenced by environment. Okay. So we could spend a week talking about the neurological changes. I'm going to stop there because those are the big, huge kind of chunks and areas. So I really want to show this video. So I'm going to stop sharing real quick. So Donna, I can see you. If you just, when I start this, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it and see it. Hear it and see it when I start it, if you don't mind. I think it'll be fine. And I'm gonna make it bigger, guys, once I get it started.
It's bigger, but you can't hear it very well.
Okay, just 1 second. Right up. Is that better?
I can't hear it very well, but if you made it bigger, you can read the captions at the bottom.
The living human brain of all ages.
Now you can hear it.
And brain function. So we use
better?
structural MRI, if you like.
Yes, but it's not big on our screen.
15 years ago, it was widely assumed that the vast majority of brain development takes place in the first few years of life. Back then, 15 years ago, we didn't have the ability to look inside the living human brain and track development across the lifespan. In the past decade or so, mainly due to advances in brain imaging technology such as magnetic resonance imaging or MRI, neuroscientists have started to look inside the living human brain of all ages and to track changes in brain structure and brain function. So we use structural MRI, if you like, to take a snapshot, a photograph at really high resolution of the inside of the living human brain. And we can ask questions like, how much gray matter does the brain contain and how does that change with age? And we also use functional MRI called fMRI to take a video, a movie of brain activity when participants are taking part in some kind of task, like thinking or feeling or perceiving something. So many labs around the world are involved in this kind of research, and we now have a really rich and detailed picture of how the living human brain develops. And this picture has radically changed the way we think about human brain development by revealing that it's not all over in early childhood, and instead, the brain continues to develop right throughout adolescence and into the 20s and 30s. So adolescence is defined as the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. It can go on a long time. One of the brain regions that changes most dramatically during adolescence is called prefrontal cortex. So this is a model of the human brain, and this is prefrontal cortex right at the front. Prefrontal cortex is an interesting brain area. It's proportionally much bigger in humans than in any other species, and it's involved in a whole range of high-level cognitive functions, things like decision-making, planning what you're going to do tomorrow or next week or next year, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, so stopping yourself saying something really rude or doing something really stupid. It's also involved in social interaction, understanding other people, and self-awareness. So MRI studies looking at the development of this region have shown that it really undergoes dramatic development during the period of adolescence. So if you look at grey matter volume, for example, grey matter volume across age from age 4 to 22 years increases during childhood, which is what you can see on this graph. It peaks in early adolescence. The arrows indicate peak grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex. You can see that that peak happens a couple of years later in boys relative to girls, and that's probably because boys go through puberty a couple of years later than girls on average. And then during adolescence, there's a significant decline in grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex. Now that might sound bad, but actually this is a really important developmental process because grey matter contains cell bodies and connections between cells, the synapses. And this decline in grey matter volume during prefrontal cortex is thought to correspond to synaptic pruning, the elimination of unwanted synapses. This is a really important process. It's partly dependent on the environment that the animal or the human is in that synapses that are being used are strengthened and synapses that aren't being used in that particular environment are pruned away. You can think of it a bit like pruning a rose bush. You prune away the weaker branches so that the remaining important branches can grow stronger. And this process, which effectively fine-tunes brain tissue according to the species-specific environment, is happening in prefrontal cortex and in other brain regions during the period of human adolescence. So a second line of inquiry that we use to track changes in the adolescent brain is using functional MRI to look at changes in brain activity across age. So I'll just give you an example from my lab. So in my lab, we're interested in the social brain. That is the network of brain regions that we use to understand other people and to interact with other people. So I like to show a photograph of a soccer game to illustrate two aspects of how your social brains work. So this is a soccer game. Michael Owen has just missed a goal and he's lying on the ground. And the first aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates is how automatic and instinctive social emotional responses are. So within a split second of Michael Owen missing this goal, everyone is doing the same thing with their arms and the same thing with their face. Even Michael Owen, as he slides along the grass, is doing the same thing with his arms and presumably has a similar facial expression. And the only people who don't are the guys in yellow at the back. And I think they're on the wrong end of the stadium and they're doing another social emotional response that we all instantly recognize. And that's the second aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates, how good we are at reading other people's behavior, their actions, their gestures, their facial expressions in terms of their underlying emotions and mental states. So you don't have to ask any of these guys. You have a pretty good idea of what they're feeling and thinking at this precise moment in time. So that's what we're interested in looking at in my lab. So in my lab, we bring adolescents and adults into the lab to have a brain scan. We give them some kind of task that involves thinking about other people, their minds, their mental states, their emotions. And one of the findings that we've found several times now, as have other labs around the world, is part of the prefrontal cortex called medial prefrontal cortex, which is shown in blue on the slide. And it's right in the middle of prefrontal cortex, in the midline of your head. This region is more active in adolescents when they make these social decisions and think about other people than it is in adults. And this is actually a meta-analysis of 9 different studies in this area from labs around the world. And they all show the same thing, that activity in this medial prefrontal cortex area decreases during the period of adolescence. And we think that might be because adolescents and adults use a different mental approach, a different cognitive strategy to make social decisions. And one way of looking at that is to do behavioral studies, whereby we bring people into the lab and we give them some kind of behavioral task. And I'll just give you another example of the kind of task that we use in my lab. So imagine that you're the participant in one of our experiments. You come to the lab, You see this computerized task. In this task, you see a set of shelves. Now, there are objects on these shelves, on some of them, and you'll notice there's a guy standing behind the set of shelves, and there are some objects that he can't see. They're included from his point of view with a kind of grey piece of wood. This is the same set of shelves from his point of view. Notice that there are only some objects that he can see, whereas there are many more objects that you can see. Now, your task is to move objects around. The director standing behind the set of shelves is going to direct you to move objects around. But remember, he's not going to ask you to move objects that he can't see. This introduces a really interesting condition whereby there's a kind of conflict between your perspective and the director's perspective. So imagine he tells you to move the top truck left. There are 3 trucks there. You're going to instinctively go for the white truck because that's the top truck from your perspective. But then you have to remember, oh, he can't see that truck, so he must mean me to move the blue truck, which is the top truck from his perspective. Now, believe it or not, normal, healthy, intelligent adults like you make errors about 50% of the time on that kind of trial. They move the white truck instead of the blue truck. So we give this kind of task to adolescents and adults, and we also have a control condition where there's no director, and instead we give people a rule. We tell them, okay, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but this time there's no director. Instead, you've got to ignore objects with a dark grey background. You'll see that this is exactly the same condition, only in the no director condition, they just have to remember to apply this somewhat arbitrary rule, whereas in the director condition, they have to remember to take into account the director's perspective in order to guide their ongoing behaviour. Okay, so if I just show you the percentage errors in a large developmental study we did, this is in a study ranging from age 7 to adulthood, and what you're going to see is the percentage errors in the adult group in both conditions. So the grey is the director condition, and you see that our intelligent adults are making errors about 50% of the time, whereas they make far fewer errors when there's no director present, when they just have to remember that rule of ignoring the grey background. Developmentally, these 2 conditions develop in exactly the same way between late childhood and mid-adolescence. There's an improvement, in other words, a reduction of errors in both of these trials, in both of these conditions. But it's when you compare the last 2 groups, the mid-adolescent group and the adult group, where things get really interesting, because there is no continued improvement in the no director condition. In other words, everything you need to do in order to remember the rule and apply it seems to be fully developed by mid-adolescence. Whereas in contrast, if you look at the last 2 grey bars, there's still a significant improvement in the director condition between mid-adolescence and adulthood. And what this means is that the ability to take into account someone else's perspective in order to guide ongoing behaviour, which is something, by the way, that we do in everyday life all the time, is still developing in mid to late adolescence. So if you have a teenage son or a daughter and you sometimes think they have problems taking other people's perspectives, you're right, they do, and this is why. So we sometimes laugh about teenagers. They're parodied, sometimes even demonized in the media for their kind of typical teenage behavior. They take risks, they're sometimes moody, they're very self-conscious. I have a really nice anecdote from a friend of mine who said that the thing he noticed most about his teenage daughters before and after puberty was their level of embarrassment in front of him. So he said, before puberty, if my 2 daughters were messing around in a shop, I'd say, hey, stop messing around and I'll sing your favourite song. And instantly they'd stop messing around and he'd sing their favourite song. After puberty, that became the threat. The very notion of their dad singing in public was enough to make them behave. So people often ask, well, is adolescence the kind of recent phenomenon? Is it something we've invented recently in the West? And actually, the answer is probably not. There are lots of descriptions of adolescence in history that sound very similar to the descriptions we use today. So there's a famous quote by Shakespeare from The Winter's Tale, where he describes adolescence as follows. I would there were no age between 10 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there's nothing in the between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancient tree, stealing, fighting. He then goes on to say, having said that, would any but these boiled brains of 19 and 2 and 20 hunt in this weather? So, almost 400 years ago, Shakespeare was portraying adolescents in a very similar light to the light that we portray them in today. But today, we try to understand their behavior in terms of the underlying changes that are going on in their brain. So, for example, take risk taking. We know that adolescents have a tendency to take risks. They do. They take more risks than children or adults, and they are particularly prone to taking risks when they're with their friends. There's an important drive to become independent from one's parents and to impress one's friends in adolescence. But now we try to understand that in terms of the development of a part of their brain called the limbic system. So I'm going to show you the limbic system in red in the slide behind me and also on this brain. So the limbic system is right deep inside the brain, and it's involved in things like emotion processing and reward processing. It gives you the rewarding feeling out of doing fun things, including taking risks. It gives you the kick out of taking risks. And this region, the regions within the limbic system, have been found to be hypersensitive to the rewarding feeling of risk-taking in adolescents compared with adults. And at the very same time, the prefrontal cortex, which you can see in blue in the slide here, which stops us taking excessive risks, is still very much in development in adolescents. So brain research has shown that the adolescent brain undergoes really quite profound development. And this has implications for education, for rehabilitation and intervention. The environment, including teaching, can and does shape the developing adolescent brain. And yet it's only relatively recently that we have been routinely educating teenagers in the West. All four of my grandparents, for example, left school in their early adolescence. They had no choice. And that's still the case for many, many teenagers around the world today. 40% of teenagers don't have access to secondary school education. And yet this is a period of life where the brain is particularly adaptable and malleable. It's a fantastic opportunity for learning and creativity. So what's sometimes seen as the problem with adolescents, heightened risk-taking, poor impulse control, self-consciousness, shouldn't be stigmatized. It actually reflects changes in the brain that provide an excellent opportunity for education and social development. Thank you.
Right. I love a good TED Talk. Okay, so what do y'all think about that?
I liked what she said. I actually wish I would have heard, and I wish I would have taken this course and heard her talk before my kids entered into the whole puberty thing, because I don't think I would have been so defensive. Like, why are they doing that? What is wrong with them? I mean, like, truly, stuff is going on. And so I think I would have been a little bit more sympathetic and understanding. I mean, I had to learn the hard way. It was like, you know, am I going to get along with them and try to, but I think this would have brought me to a whole nother level of, oh, this is like normal. And that would have really helped me. I think this should be a parenting class for anybody who's going to be a parent.
Yeah. Good point. That's good. Anybody else?
I thought it was interesting where she talks about it in adolescence when she was comparing from the director's point of view about trying to get them to see things from another person's perspective. Because again, I always have to refer it back to I'm kindergarten. And so a lot of that makes sense because we spend so much time in kinder when they've done something, you know, that we think is mean or whatever, trying to get them to see that, you know, how does that make that other person feel? And now by like watching this, sometimes I feel like in kindergarten, they're looking at you like, I don't understand. I mean, I don't get what you're saying. That doesn't even compute in my brain right now, another person's perspective.
Yeah. And I think one of the points that I think we need to think about it when you're talking about this, Marilyn, is that by the time they're 14 or 15, they actually have every tool they need to do that. Right. And it's a skill, which means you can learn how to really do it well. Right. So you have all the tools you need so it's really hard for a 5-year-old versus a 14-year-old. Right. That show. I mean, that's why that graph that she put up is really important, because they're basically saying kids really struggle with this. Obviously, we kind of all know that. Adults don't do great with it either. They failed about over 50% of the time. But the key is empathy, which is mainly kind of what she's talking about, because perspective taking is a large part of empathy, is a skill-based thing that we have all the tools we need for it by the time we're 14, roughly, right? So you can teach it and you can learn how to do it well. So you can't teach it when they're 5. You can start helping them understand it and see it. But by the time they're 14 or 15, the lessons seem to sink in a little better, right? And also they've got more experience and more things have happened to them, and and they've seen something happen to their friend, and then I mean, there's just all these things that they kind of understand a little bit more.
I have a question for you. She
Yeah.
was talking about gray matter, that it peaks in adolescence, and she said this is important because I guess that's where the cells and the synapses are connecting.
Yeah.
She said, but I don't understand the pruning away.
Yeah.
Like a rose bush, and so it's a good thing. So, but I don't know. So are we cleaning off the gray matter, or is it developing? I don't.
It just develops. So it's kind of like what I was talking about pruning a while ago. The synapses that we have, we're building them. When we start getting to adolescence, we start really using certain ones over and over and over and over. The ones we don't use, sometimes we don't need them. Like sometimes we don't need those certain ones anymore. We just get rid of them,
Those fall
and
off.
we only focus on the other ones. Now you can also build synapses past adolescence, but this time in the brain's life is when that's really happening all the time, which is why one of the reasons why for our identity is so difficult to put our finger on sometimes too.
So it's not an infinite amount that you have. It comes off, and then you can grow some new ones.
Right.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Susan, you're muted.
Sorry, thanks. I was going to say on her demonstration or her study about perspective, it was confusing to me though, because I feel like I would really be interested to see any sort of criticism about that study. Obviously it must have done well if there's a TED Talk, but I think that it was visually hard. Do you know what I mean? Like there was something going on almost. I think I'm a pretty empathic. I know I'm an empathic person, but still visually, I was having a hard time myself with. So I would be curious if that perspective really relates to empathy in that example.
So she wasn't talking about empathy alone. She was only talking about perspective taking.
Okay.
And perspective taking is one of really 3 big parts of empathy, right?
That makes sense
to
me then.
It's a behavioral. So this is the key to it. Not that there wouldn't be critique of it. Like if we could read the study, we could critique it for sure. Gotcha. Absolutely. The key of this is it was a behavioral study, not a study on empathy or emotion or anything. Because I think I feel like what you're saying is what if we would have introduced something else besides what they were introducing, right? Like another variable, like feeling or something, maybe that would change the way that someone responds, right? Or the way that someone does something. This is literally just a behavioral.
Okay.
Just a behavioral. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. it was interesting because I was like, my brain it was like a puzzle, like a game we were playing almost. And my brain had a lot easier time with it when it was gray, just like the study showed.
No, and you should have an easier time with it. Here's the other thing. This is what I was saying earlier. So it's really quite possible that as we get into adulthood, our skill of empathy, which perspective taking is a part of, continues to really grow and develop, and we wouldn't have really any trouble with that particular activity because you know what I'm saying? Like it's kind of like a muscle, right? We build it. And so like I just rode the bike for 2 hours before I took this class. A year ago, I would never been able to do that. Now I can because I've built up the ability to do that. Same thing with perspective taking, right? Your ability to take someone else's perspective, we might not have always been great at it, but if we practice it, we could get really good at it, right? So does that make sense? I think I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's a great point, Susan. I'm also I do critique studies I read too, for sure. Absolutely. but looking at this from a behavioral perspective is
That's
kind of what
helpful.
she's talking about. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Anybody else?
I
All
liked how
right.
they talked about risk. Araceli Fuentes.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
liked how she talked about the risk, and but she also focused on the brain part where she was showing that how it
Mhm.
changes from each angle from childhood to, I believe, adolescence. If I was, or how it shows there's different types of stimuli, and I was like, oh,
Mhm.
that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like what we were talking about, the parts that we need to be lit up aren't lit up as well as they need to be, right? In
Yeah,
adolescence. And that's why we make bad decisions. You can't, you get, and here's the kicker. We really probably shouldn't get down on ourselves for making those bad decisions because we weren't really wired to make great decisions all the time,
true.
which is a big deal because there's plenty of us and plenty of your clients that maybe are suffering with some kind of guilt from a decision they made when they were 15. Now, obviously, there's a continuum of how important those decisions are. I get that, absolutely. But we carry around, like we generate our own guilt and shame. We don't need help doing it. We can just do it ourselves. But if we're carrying around something that happened that we were a part of at 15 or 16, we might not have been in a great place to make a decision. I worked with a client. This has been a few years. This has probably been 10 years ago, maybe not that long, but he was an adult at the time. I think he was in his 40s, and I was working with him on an individual thing. And I did a whole kind of relationship history and then a family history. And he was just talking about, I feel like this happened when he was 15 or 16. He made this decision to move out of his mom's house and move in with his dad, or it might have been the other way around. Moved out with one parent, moved in with the other. And then by the time he got kind of in, like out of high school, he started regretting it. And he just kind of carried this regret, like a little low level of guilt and regret for decades. And we kind of talked about it, and I didn't say it like this, but I basically asked questions and helped him see that, how many 15 or 16-year-olds make great decisions about something like that? And how many adults helped him make that decision? And how did they either manipulate him or not, kind of thing, right? Which it's easier for us to look back when in our 40s or 30s, when we're 16, and go, oh my gosh, I would do this different and this different, this different, You know what I'm saying? The reason why I'm bringing this up is because clinically speaking, these kinds of things will come up. And that's not, that at the time, it was a big decision. Right now, like looking back, it's not a gargantuan decision. His life is fine, but he carried around this guilt, like this low level of guilt and shame for like a couple of decades. And that just eats away at you. And so, and it was kind of like a light bulb went off. He's like, oh yeah, maybe I was just a dumb kid. And I think he said I was just a dumb kid, and it kind of changed his mindset almost a little bit about it. And he kind of dropped a little bit of that. So that kind of thing is important. And that's why I show this video, because it's just, I thought it was a good kind of depiction of things. So let me go back here and share a couple of things. We'll talk about a couple of other things here. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about, man, let me hang on a second. Sorry guys, just bear with me. Yeah. Okay. We'll do this. All right. So I feel like I say this in this class all the time. There's great classes that we have at Amberton specifically about drug and alcohol usage. And you'll spend time talking about adolescence and adulthood and how substance abuse affects those things. So I'm not going to hit every single thing, but I'm going to hit a couple of highlights that are really important. I think the book actually does a really good job of talking through these things. And so it's really good to read through that. We have, the US does have one of the highest rates of adolescent drug use, like in the industrialized world. our rates of usage is very high. And some of that is geographic, probably. Like, for example, in some of the smaller towns right now, some of the rural areas, things like methamphetamines are huge, really, really big because you can hide, cook, where you cook, you can hide it and it's hard to find. Heroin has kind of made a huge comeback, just kind of like opioid use in general, whether it's prescription drug use or whatever. I mean, interestingly enough, states like Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont got hit really hard with that particular, like the opioid addiction piece. Not that other areas didn't, but geographically speaking, there's just some areas that have a little bit higher drug use than others. The big difference probably in the past 50 or 60 years is that alcohol use has pretty much always been around. That's not really gone anywhere. And it's actually lessened a bit, but the drug usage is something that is more widespread. Not just marijuana. Marijuana also has been around for a long, long time, but just the other drug use has increased. Cigarette consumption actually has declined. However, the vaping industry is booming. So cigarettes themselves, the consumption of cigarettes has declined, but vaping has increased. My kids are always talking about, they're always letting us know about so-and-so got caught in the bathroom vaping or whatever. They started taking the main doors off the bathrooms and not letting kids in and trying to supervise them. This was in junior high because they were vaping in the bathroom kind of stuff. And one of our high school teachers just got caught vaping and having a party with a bunch of students like a couple weekends ago, which is kind of bad for her. And so it kind of went all over the school. And my son is not in the know. He does not care about anything like that. He's zero drama, only cares about really video games and band in his little group of friends, but even he knew about it. So it was like obviously widespread. But the vaping is really kind of really exploded kind of on the scene. And so she talked specifically about this reward center idea in the limbic system. So the middle part of our brain is where this happens. So basically she kind of highlighted it, right? The red and blue areas that she was talking about. You can think about it this way when it comes to drug and alcohol usage, or really any kind of reward, sugar, a good experience, exercising, anything that you get a feeling, dopamine gets released, right? You get a release of dopamine, it feels good. It's the feel good neurotransmitter. Serotonin is also another one, but dopamine's the big dog here. And if it's kind of that start part of our brain, the go center gets turned on. The prefrontal cortex is the stop part, the blue area she was showing, that kind of stop. It's not really online all the way yet. And so the go can overrun the stop, right? And so that's true of how the reward center works, right? So traditionally speaking, the reward center piece of our brain is where also all our instincts happen, like sleeping, eating, procreation, like any kind of instinctual, like I need to, there's just a gut instinct, I need to do this. That's where that happens too. And so when we do those things, we feel the reward from it, which in some ways is good, right? We need to have reward from things. At the same time, we also need impulse control and self-control. And when that's not on board fully yet, that's what also makes it really hard. So that's why if you have someone, clinically speaking, that say they're 20 and they start an addiction into something, and then they have a hard time with it, stopping it. That's one of the reasons why relapse is a rule of addiction. It's just something that happens. As a general rule, there's 3 to 5 relapses inside of an addiction process. Doesn't mean everyone does that, but that's an average. And that's because of this principle, the reward center. And so the earlier something like that starts, the more difficult it is to stop as you do it, because the reward center is just basically the go system's on all the time. The stop system can't catch up to it. Okay. So inside of this idea of substance use and abuse, this is one of the reasons why it's really important to think about risk factors and protective factors when it comes to adolescence. And so the peers can be a risk factor or a protective factor. Home life or environment, some aspects of culture, some aspects of how your self-image or your self-concept. Those are all either protective or risk factors as well. So there's a lot of things that are going on that can happen. I just had a new client I just started working with, a couple, and like 2 days before I started working with them, they found out their son had marijuana in his drawer, and he's like 14 or something, whatever. And they just found it. Of course, he said it wasn't his. That's what they all say, which maybe it wasn't, but that impulse control is just not on board yet. And that's why things like that happen. All right. There's a couple things I want to get to before we do our group. Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of studies about effectiveness of schools with adolescents, and these are interesting because technically the lower the lower the student to counselor ratios are, the better the kids typically perform, because, and the same thing with having smaller class sizes. We know that kids typically do better, and that's true pretty much across the board. There's a couple of things in here that are important, like thinking about things like not just their academics, but their socio-emotional development, which schools have been doing a lot more of since the 90s, just kind of inside their curriculum, which is actually really helpful for them. Like understanding peers and developing empathy. I can just speak, if I could just take a second and talk about empathy just in general from a clinical perspective. If as a clinician, if I can help either couples or individuals I'm working with develop empathy, more empathetic skills, then that's so helpful for people. Having empathy is sometimes really hard to develop the older we get at some level, but if we can help them develop it early, it really makes a big difference in our life. And so our socio-emotional development is super important. And it's really important during this time because our emotions are also all over the place. I mean, they're just everywhere, up and down. And so a lot of schools have kind of incorporated some of that into their curriculum. When we talk about religion and identity development, some of those things go hand in hand. One of the things that really starts happening in adolescence, especially the older they get, is their ability to start thinking abstractly, right? So as kids, we think more black and white for the most part. But as we get into adolescence, we start to think about different viewpoints and different ideas and different concepts. And that could even mean different religious or spiritual concepts. And it's typically a part of our identity development. It's a part that we really need to go through, because abstract thinking is something that's very important for us. Because what it leads to is the ability to have critical thought, not criticizing thought, but critical thought. And that starts with being able to think abstractly. Now, some people have trouble thinking abstractly. Some certain personalities are a little more black and white thinking. That's not abnormal, and that's fine too. But we do have a tendency to at least question things and have an abstract thought as we go through adolescence. The reason why I bring it up here is because in religious and spiritual circles, abstract thought is not super It makes people nervous because spiritual concepts tend to be seen as more black and white. And when we throw these kids in here that are thinking abstractly and asking questions like, what about this? And what about this? What about this? And especially if they're actually really smart and then they read parts of the Bible and they're like, hey, it said this here and then this happened kind of thing. It makes people nervous in our spiritual or religious. And I'm not just talking about in the Christian world. This is true in other religious faiths as well. Because we know for sure that religion has a positive influence on adolescent life. We know that for sure. Just the simple concept of prayer has a really positive impact on people in general. Same thing with community, having a sense of community and belonging, having a sense of something being bigger than us, that matters too. But in our spiritual, as we develop spiritually and religiously, we are also developing this ability to think abstractly, which makes a lot of people in a black and white world really, really kind of nervous, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I want to add one thing into that because it was making me, I never thought about it until you just said this, but in reflecting back on my childhood, I was raised Catholic and I happen to still be Catholic. But during that time when I was hanging out with a lot of my Protestant brothers and sisters, I went to every denomination outside of Catholicism because I wanted to know, do I believe what my parents are telling me? I just wanted to form my own. I was doing critical thinking, right? I want to know, am I just going to take what they're giving me, or I've got to think through this and what makes the most sense? And that was really, really helpful to be able to go do that at, 16, 17, 18 to figure it out myself.
I think what you're talking about is what is actually happening with adolescence. We go through adolescence, and not just in our spiritual life, but in other parts of our life. We want to know. We've been given these concepts, whether they're beliefs or concepts or principles, by our parents and other authorities, and we want to know if we believe them. Other people do, and we know that, right? But do I believe it? That's kind of an important part of our process. It's also a really important part of our identity development as we get older. So the problem with it is, in my experience, is that is seen as sometimes dangerous by people. And I don't think it is. I just think that's a little bit of an ignorance about what that actual process is. Most of us come out on the other side of that process fine. It's like a high percentage. Now, there's definitely going to be people that come out on the other side of that process and think differently and believe differently and behave differently and things like that. That's definitely going to happen. But it's this particular thing is a really personal, autonomous process that we all go through, all of us, not just some of us. Everybody goes through it. So, having said that, I wanted to talk about it here because in a form of, like in the case of our religious and spiritual development, that's still happening too. But when you throw in this adolescent concept of like thinking abstractly, sometimes that makes people uncomfortable, or it can make people uncomfortable. I've had many, 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 many conversations. I was just talking to my wife about this last week, about one of our really good friends. We're still friends with them. At this time, her son was, I think, 20 or something, and he was really struggling. And she had been talking to me about him, and I said, I think he's going to be okay. He's going through this, and he's definitely making bad decisions. There's a lot of things he's going through, but he's going to make it because you guys gave him a good foundation. There's a lot of good things that you've taught him. He's going to come back to. It's just going to take him a little while to get back to it, and that's kind of what happened. Now, that doesn't happen with everybody, for sure. But I began, because of this abstract thinking idea, personally, my philosophy of working with adolescents is not looking at them where they are, but what they're going to be. I try to look at someone and say, well, they're here right now, but that's not where they're going to be, right? They're going to be vastly different in 10 years. We can't just say, this is who you are and this is who you are forever, and just put them in a box. That's the worst thing you can do. They're going to be different. You got to look at someone and say, well, this is where you are right now, but that's not where you're going to be. And which is an abstract thought. That's an abstract thought. And having that ability to do that really, I think in working with adolescents can be really helpful. Okay. Oh, shoot. Hit the wrong thing. Sorry. Okay, I want to make a little bit of a transition here and talk about I want to talk about families. What I'd like to do, let me stop sharing so I can see everyone. What I'd like to do is do one, like I don't know, 7-8 minute kind of discussion in breakout groups, because we got an even number, so that's good. And it's not going to be super long, but I kind of want you guys to talk with each other about a couple of things, just 2 things. Number one, what is the biggest change you think between when you were an adolescent? And I don't care when you were an adolescent, whether it was 5 years ago or 20, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. What's the biggest change you've seen in our environment? Environment's big, right? So thinking environment like culture, the world we live in. What's one of the biggest changes you've seen? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, how do you see working with adolescents, like clinically speaking, how do you see working with them in the midst of some of those kind of big changes? So what are some of the big changes you've seen? Whether it was different when it's obviously different than, for sure, different from when I was growing up in the 80s. This is a totally different world. Araceli was talking about MySpace. I mean, I had to take around quarters for a payphone if we ever, this is just a totally different world. But how does that impact us clinically too? Because we need to be thinking about that. So what's some of the biggest changes, and how do you think it's going to impact how you work with adolescents? Okay. We're going to do that for 6-7 minutes, and then we're going to come back, talk about family kind of stuff. And then, like I said, I'm going to stick around at the end to talk about questions for the class. Okay. All right. So put you guys in rooms. You should get a little link there. Just click on that and you should be good to go. Right. Hopefully I didn't catch too many people mid-sentence. All right. I'm going to talk about a couple of different things here. First of all, what were some of the big changes you guys talked about? What things came up?
Oh, well,
We talked about, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. We talked about environment changes as far as social media and the way people interact. We talked a little bit about how accepting our culture has become versus being an advocate for somebody. And that's just kind of a highlight of what we talked about is the changes in society and how a lot of adolescents feel entitled to be on varsity team, or, they are upset if they don't get the first college or university of their choice when they didn't put in all the work for it. They feel entitled. But a lot of that stems from maybe, in my opinion, society being too accepting or all inclusive, that everyone has to be included, when that's not the reality of life today, or ever, really.
What else?
I think one of the things we talked about, like Rosa is such, like I liked hearing Rosa's story because she was the one I was partnered with, and she came from and she was growing up in Mexico at the time, but she was talking about how there wasn't like social media, and like it was more tied to family and cult and family at that time. Like your peers were more identified with your were tied more to family, and how we thought certain things, like how certain things made a big deal to us, and now we could move back from that. But something that we did talk about too, that was, it's interesting, when we were in high school, like kids, okay, it's gonna make people, okay, let me get my point straight. So this week, the big debut of Abercrombie and Fitch Netflix came out. Anybody that has emotional damage from that, like, hear me out. If you talk to kids now, teenagers now, they are so big on equality, diversity, gender fluidity, and so it's interesting to see that, like, back in their, like, to compare and contrast that, now their kids now are more big on about diversity and are more open about talking about mental health, and more open about, and so I kind of really get excited about this youth now because they're so open about different issues that at the time were very closeted growing up.
Okay, good. Yeah, that is definitely a big difference. Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Okay. Just FYI, one of my best friends, his brother modeled for Abercrombie back in the 90s.
No way. My brother worked at Abercrombie, but they put him in the stock room because he wasn't good looking enough.
Oh, yeah. And remember, they used to pump out that really good smell out of there, too, and everything?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Because those are good
There
ones.
was one other thing I noticed. We talked similarly. I might let Melinda speak about it if she wants to now, or maybe she'll wait. But one thing that I raised that I see a lot, and I think it goes across social media issues against lots of the issues that kids face. But I feel like there's so much more pressure on today's adolescents than there were in my. I just think the pressure is very different. I think they have a lot more pressure and focus on grades and on competition, and it's just a lot higher stakes, it feels like to me. And so it may be, that's just what I've seen with my two teenagers, comparing it to my life. And I
Yeah.
used to also work as I volunteered as a teen facilitator for a group called Teen Life. So I volunteered in a school with some children that were struggling. And that's what I witnessed there as well. There's just a different level of, and
Yeah.
I think social media has brought a lot of it.
Yeah, good. That's good. Linda, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was pointing out just the difference in sexual and gender identity, and how that just seems so different, and at such a young age. I remember in junior high, my boys came home and were talking openly about friends that had either come out or identifying as pansexual, and so we had to kind of figure out what is pansexual. um, and then just seeing how I guess for some kids they'll like label themselves one thing and then they can't really shake that label when it's a time of experimentation, but
Yep.
it just seems like it just sticks with them. And I've talked to so many parents that are struggling with how to counsel their kids through that, and how to be accepting and loving, but also how to realize what might be a result of pressure of social media or peers.
Yeah. So let me talk about that real quick. These are all good. Everything y'all are talking about is good. And the reason why I bring this particular thing up is because this discussion is very important when you work with adolescents, because eventually what happens is you work with their parents for the most part too. And so this is a very different world now than even 10 years ago. I think, the iPhone came out in 2007. That's really when things started changing so rapidly in the last 15 years, really, since the iPhone came out. If we talked about social media wise, right? Like you have a computer in your hand, you can go anywhere in the world on your phone. I mean, that's when that started happening, which I thought was the greatest thing that's ever happened. And I still love it. I mean, I think there's some great things about technology and there's great things about social media. Let me talk a little bit specifically about the gender identity piece. I think clinically speaking, and again, like I feel like I do say this all the time. You guys are going to talk about this more specifically in other classes. And so I'm just going to hit on a couple of things here. The way in which I think I have seen, like the things that seem to help clinically speaking, if we talk about parents for a second, not necessarily the adolescent, because this is kind of the area we're about to jump into is the family aspect of adolescence. There's no right or wrong answer here. There's not really a great answer. There's not really a like, well, here's my magic wand and this is what you say. That's not really what we're trying to get to. I think we need to look at it from a little bit different perspective if we can. If we think about this clinically, our job as clinicians first is to, if we're working with families, is to help them learn how to whatever that is. If it's be better listeners or be more understanding or figure out what they're thinking about and feeling. Because a lot of what you're talking about, especially with the gender specific questions, it hits us so hard because we don't have an understanding of it. Where versus the kids that are in the middle of it, they have a better understanding of it. It doesn't hit them as hard, right? So for us, it's very important for us to know a couple of things as adults. We need to know how we feel and what we're thinking. Like have a really good grasp of like self-awareness is very important, right? It's okay to feel and think what you're feeling and thinking. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're mad or if you're upset or if you're confused, if you're helpless, if whatever it is, but it's not okay just to do anything we want to do and say anything we want to say. That's not okay. Does that make sense? Those are two separate things. What I have found is that most of the time, now I'm talking about clinically, okay? Most of the folks you guys are going to see are going to come to you after something has already been done or said. most of the time. And a lot of times it's bad. People don't come see us because they're in a great place. You know what I'm saying? Like, people don't come see us because like their life's fine and everything's fine and I'm great. That's not what we get. That's not who we get typically, right? We get people that are having a hard time with something. And this particular issue is a big something right now. It's a really big something because it's new as in the last 5 or 6 years. I first started hearing about it probably within the last 5 or 6 years, like a lot more and more. Not just because of my kids. I'm talking about, I heard about it before my kids were even in junior high. I started hearing about it. I would encourage everyone to not just look at this issue from the standpoint of what you hear or what you think, but to really read about it, because there's a lot of really good research coming out now about a lot of these things. It's very important to be up on what a lot of the research is saying, and you can look at it critically. You don't have to just take everything you read, and you can look at it critically. But it's very important for us as clinicians not to lead with, hey, I think this might be right. We don't need to lead like that. We need to be able to lead from a standpoint of, here's what's going on, because this is a process, a developmental process that adolescents are going through. It's just another part of their developmental process. Okay. Having said that, let me share. Hang on a second. Sorry. I'm going to share this differently here. Let me get this over here. Okay. I do want to talk about a couple of things that I think are really important. And these are just, again, based on what we know research-wise from speaking from the family perspective. Dr. Heber does a really great marriage and family therapy class. Talks about a lot of these things. He does a really good job of talking about it from a family perspective. I'm just going to do a couple of kind of broad strokes here. There's a lot of changes in parental monitoring and information management as kids get older, right? Because when they're young, we are the monitors in information. You know what I'm saying? Like the adults are everything. Kids don't manage that. Now, as they get older, they start managing it. My daughter comes in last night and says, I want to go to this movie with my best friend, Nina. And we're like, okay, that's cool. Oh, and by the way, my boyfriend and her boyfriend are going. Well, that kind of changes the information, right? That changes what potentially may or may not happen. And, hey, can I go on a walk with my friends? Okay, well, tell me who's going to be there. Oh, it's just my friends. Well, that's not telling me information, right? So there's just changes that happen in general. The social settings are changing. The activities are changing. Friends are changing. Academic efforts are changing. Kind of to your point. Somewhat, Susan, I think, was bringing that up. There's definitely more pressure now than ever before, academically speaking. Lots of pressure on lots of things. I think a lot of the pressure actually comes from the amount of choices that there are now, not from necessarily just the pressure. But one of the things we know is that if parents can engage in what's called positive parenting practices, we know that those are better for families, not just the teenager, but the family. Now, some of these, and I've listed them here, they're in the notes right here. Some of these should make a ton of sense. I mean, like setting boundaries. Boundaries are really important, but boundaries also shift and change a bit as they get older. In other words, if you set a curfew at, I don't know, you got a 13-year-old that, my daughter likes to walk. All her friends, they like to walk. And of course, they want to do it at like 8:00 at night. And, we had a rule when she was younger, you have to be in by dark and blah, blah, whatever. As they drive, if your rule is you got to be in by 8 and they're driving, that's not going to work. Or if they go off to college and they come home and your rule is you got to be in bed by 8 and they're a 20-year-old, that doesn't work, right? You got to readjust your boundaries. So you have to set the boundary, but also be able to readjust them as you need to. We need to really work hard on building connection to gain cooperation. It's hard to have really good rules without really good relationships. Not that doesn't mean you don't need rules, but for them to work better, the relationships need to be as healthy as they can. Doesn't mean that you agree on everything. It doesn't mean that everything's always okay. It just means you have to work harder. I think what's hard about the adolescent piece with parents, from my experience, just personally, and in the therapy room, is that we all want to have connections with our kids. It's just harder and harder to do it at times. So you as the adult have to work harder, not expect your kid to work harder. The adult has to work harder at it. You do need to be firm. That kind of goes back to the boundaries piece. This one's a big one. Avoid shaming. This room is a pigsty. Everyone does. I've said that your room is so disgusting. You're 13. You need to act like it. That comes out of adults' mouths all the time. The hard part about that is basically you're throwing this whole cloud of shame on top of somebody that some kids can take and they're fine and some kids can't. And so avoiding that is actually really important. Using shame and guilt and fear is not really the greatest way to parent. Doing it out of trust and firmness and boundaries is better, which I can give examples of. Let me go through this list. I can give examples of some of these as we go, but natural consequences are big. Brian, I think one of the things you just mentioned is in terms of like, hey, not everything's fair all the time. Like when we, in our life, we're going to have things that are not going to be fair or not going to work out like we want, or we're not going to get something we think we deserve or whatever. There's going to be consequences to things, right? In other words, if I make a decision or my kid makes a decision as small as like I left my lunchbox or whatever, I left my homework. If I make a decision and I'm always coming and bringing that to them or always helping them, always picking them up, it actually works against their self-concept, actually. I think that one of the things that's happened in this area in terms of like consequences is about 1981 or 2. I can't remember the exact year. There was a study out of either USC or UCLA. I can't remember the school. The study was on what we're talking about right now, this like idea of like kind of how do we nurture, how do we encourage, how do we help our kids? And the study was actually a really good study, and the results of the study were really good, but people took the results and kind of shifted them and changed them to all of a sudden make us think that we need to give medals to every kid, and we need to save kids from things, and we need to, and in other words, if we do these things for them and kind of hold them up, that's going to help them along the way. The study actually didn't say anything about that, but the kind of, not the self-help, but the parenting industry, book industry kind of took that and ran with it. And in the 90s, you saw a lot of that kind of idea. And what we know now is that that's the exact opposite. For example, I'll give you a really small example. If so my kids tying their shoe, they're 5, whatever, 4 or 5, they're tying their shoe. I could get real impatient and be like, let me just do it. Well, the kid doesn't care, but that's not good for them. A bigger example would be learning an instrument. Both our kids have learned instruments. My son plays clarinet, and he sounded horrible when he first started. But you're supposed to. You're supposed to make mistakes. This is the key. We have to make mistakes in order to do what? To learn and grow and develop. If we don't make mistakes, and if we're not allowed to make mistakes, it makes growing and developing harder. And as we get older and we make a mistake, like say we're 25 or 22 and we make a mistake, and it's actually a bigger mistake as you get older, right? It's not like something small. and that's the first time you've ever had to deal with a consequence, that's not good. If you're 25 and that's the first time you've had to deal with something really hard. Does that make sense? Versus, hey, when I was 10, I went through this thing and it was, no, man, this really thing happened. And or I kept messing up over and over. And I'm not saying that we need to intentionally mess our kids up. That's not what I'm saying. But we need to let them make mistakes and let them do that. That's really hard for a lot of people, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? The reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is how we develop. This is how human beings develop and grow. And this is actually how we develop wisdom more than anything, which is really kind of combined experience and learning how to make decisions and that kind of thing. So these ideas of trying not natural consequences and kind of using logical consequences. In other words, if someone makes a mistake, and your consequence is the same every single time, that's not going to work either. You need to have a consequence that kind of fits, the mistake that was made or something that happened. Positive reinforcement works better than negative reinforcement for the most part. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to have negative reinforcement, because we will, but positive reinforcement typically works better for our human beings in general than negative reinforcement does. Modeling respect, I think, is the biggest issue that parents have when I work with them clinically. The big thing that I've heard for years is my kids don't respect me. They don't have respect for me. They don't have respect for this. And my question is, well, how do you respect them? Because respect is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street, and it's earned and lost. It's both. And so you have to really practice modeling respect. And that means modeling respect in other situations too, not just with your kids. And striving for empathy. So these 9 things are kind of the 9 areas of positive parenting. A lot of these seem fairly normal and natural. Some of these maybe not as much. I think that we have to be, as clinicians, we kind of have to also keep in mind a couple of other things. And I don't know if I wrote it down in here. I don't think I put it in this deck. The other thing that's really important when we talk about positive parenting is there's 2 big concepts that the most healthy, most positive parents do, or the families that seem to work the best. And that's be adaptable to whatever's going on and be flexible. Adaptability, especially in our ability to adapt to our surroundings and being flexible with our kids, not less boundaries. I'm not saying you don't have less boundaries, but being flexible in how you're even, kind of what you're even thinking. Being adaptable and flexible those 2 big concepts seem to equate to really positive experiences in families. Actually, in my counseling assessment class, we talk about this really specifically from a standpoint of assessing those 2 big concepts with families, because you can actually assess those 2 things. Okay. Yeah, I always run out of time. I'm always going to run out of time. There's no way I'm going to hit everything. I'm gonna pick up with some of this stuff when we talk about adulthood. So we'll kind of jump in with that. Our next class. I'll always run out of time. All right, let me get back over here. Okay. So it's 11 o'clock. I want to be mindful of you guys' time. I'm going to stay on for as long as you guys want. If you have questions about anything, it could be about what we just did or anything in the class. And so if you have questions, you're more than welcome to stay on the Zoom here. If not, you can go and do something else and have a great day. But anybody that has questions, this will be a great time. Just make sure you unmute yourself.
So I know I constantly bug you, doctor, but just asking, I just have to shoot my shot and ask. The paper that's due today, is there any way we could get an extension? We just had our midterm. I'm like, can we just turn it on Monday?
Yeah, I don't care. That's fine.
Really? You're not
Yeah,
gonna
sure.
get like all mad at us. Like I'm not gonna get like I feel already the guilt. I already feel the shame. I feel it all. I was like, oh my
Yeah.
God. I'm like,
Yeah.
I forgot I had my baby. I know I didn't forget. I was trying to work on it every
Yeah.
capacity. But I was like, oh my gosh, the midterm took a lot out of
I
me.
don't, yeah, I don't know if y'all picked up, but I'm fairly easygoing about stuff. I actually want you to learn, and I'm not hard over on that. I don't want you to feel guilty about it unless the guilt is positive guilt, right? We can have positive guilt that motivates us.
Is she talking about the exercise 3, or is she talking about the research paper?
I'm
Because I
talking
hope
about
we didn't.
exercise 3.
Huh?
Yeah, just exercise, not the
Okay,
not, the
good.
research papers do like.
Good. I thought I wrote it maybe in the
Yeah.
wrong place. Okay, good. Thanks.
I feel like the paper's due in like May, right, or something. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
it's due in May.
Yeah, like the 7th maybe or something.
Yeah.
14th, I don't remember.
Can you
The
talk a little
14th.
bit about the paper,
Yes.
lengthwise and some more details?
Yeah. So the paper, I think the only thing I didn't put on the description is the length. I think the very first class I might have talked about 4 to 6 pages. I think is probably plenty for it. The big thing about that paper is you need to have 3 outside sources other than the book. You can use the book as a source for sure, but you need to have 3 other outside sources other than the book. That's where that research part comes in, right? When you're going to pick a stage, a development, talk about that stage, and then some kind of disorder or an issue in that stage, and then the treatment that goes with that. That's kind of your big research chunk. And you'll get a lot of that information from the book and 3 outside sources. And then the second part is the reflection. And there's like 4 questions that I asked you to think about in the reflection part. That you don't need to cite anything there unless it's not your idea, but typically our reflection is our ideas. And so that's why it's kind of a hybrid. It's not technically a full research paper. It's a little hybrid of both. 4 to 6 pages is probably plenty, I would say. I would love it for it to be 4, but it's up to y'all. I know some people write more and some less. That's fine. Does that help, Joanne? Hopefully.
So
Yes,
when
yes, absolutely. Thanks.
So when you in looking at this, because you did say 4 to 6 pages, and you say APA style, obviously not a title page, no abstract, but just when you say APA, you just mean the 1-inch margins,
Yep.
citation within the text, the references, and is it like a double spaced or whatever?
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's all APA. The reflection part, you still use the format of APA, but you're probably not citing anything. You don't need an abstract for sure because it's not a full research paper, but you'll just do the citation. That's why I gave you that exercise to kind of practice that, especially if this is your first, paper doing APA, because we have a lot of students in this class. This is their first class. So that's why I kind of do that. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
I have a question that I'm embarrassed to ask. I probably should know, but if we're not doing a title page, you just want it in the header so that you can identify whose paper.
Okay.
is
Yeah, we do need a title page. There does need to be
Okay.
a title page. Yeah. Yeah.
For the resource, for the citations, if we're doing citations, I know that sometimes it just depends on the professor, but if I'm citing a source, what is your minimum reference year? Like if I wanted to cite something from 2004, would you be like, no, that is way too old, come on now? Or you're like, it needs to be within 2018 to 2022.
Oh, I don't care about that.
Okay.
I don't care about it. This topic, like development, the developmental process and the theories around it are old.
Right. That's what I was getting some
There's not a lot of not a ton of new stuff out there. So I'm not worried about the year part. That's a good question, but I'm not worried about that.
Okay. I just want to make sure, because I was like, I want you to be like, oh my gosh, are you citing something from 1987, Araceli? And I'm like, my bad. I'm sorry.
I had in my dissertation, I had some stuff from the 70s and 80s, and most of it was the 2000s, but Yeah, I'm not worried about that.
Well, Harvard Business Review has a lot of good stuff, but it's old. So, and that's a good source.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are going to find most of your sources from like social science journals is where you're going to find most of your information. That's where I would head that direction. If you ever have questions about that, the library actually is super helpful. You can call them. I think you can chat with them even. I mean, they're really, really good at helping students with research. Really good at it.
We have a lot of access to research journals.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Just online access.
Through EBSCO, you can find anything you need. Yeah, absolutely.
So I have a question for the next video stream that we have for class. I see in Moodle we have up until the adolescent slideshows. Do we have an adult slideshow as well, or is that just going to be note taking?
No, it'll be PowerPoints. I just haven't put them on yet.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, that's on May 7th, looks like. Yeah, we'll have I try to do PowerPoints for all the classes just so you can have it. And I'll try to get them up the week like before the class, so you can pull them up. I'm just lazy. I haven't put them up yet. That's all.
I have another off-topic question, which you mentioned you teach another class, the assessments. Is it similar in structure to this one?
Yeah, pretty much all my classes are very similar in terms of structure.
Okay.
Yeah. Now it depends because like last fall I taught that class on a Saturday in Frisco. So we are doing more in-person classes. So it kind of depends on the semester. So if it's a distance learning class, then it's like this, but if it's in person, it'll be a little bit different.
Okay. But do you know if you're teaching it in online or in person next semester?
I think next in the summer, I'm teaching that class online, I think.
Sounds good. Thanks.
If I'm not mistaken.
What's the name of the class again?
That's the counseling assessment class.
Okay.
Yeah. Usually between me and Dr. Armstrong, there'll be, I don't know if there are 2 offerings this time or not. I don't know. I have no idea. I never know who's going to be in the class. I mean, I just show up, whoever's there, we go. So.
Thank you.
I'm curious. I just started with Amberton 2 sessions ago. I'm just kind of slowly doing one class at a time and have only done online. The in-person classes, so for us with online, we're given like 4 or 5 days to take the exam.
Mm-hmm.
When it's meeting on Saturdays or meeting on Thursday nights or however it is the tests that night, or do we go home and we still have that opportunity and flexibility?
So I think different professors do it differently, right? So some professors will give it to you right then, like during class, and you'll take it in class. I do all my exams exactly the same, online or in person. It's always starts on a Friday and ends on a Wednesday, and you have that 4 days or 5 days or however long to take it. That's how I do it. But everyone kind of does it differently. Everyone's kind of got their own style. My tests are always multiple choice and always give you a study guide. So that's what I do, but not everyone does it that way. And some students like my way and some students like it the other way. It just kind of depends on what you like. So you should be able to know most of that information from the syllabus. Here's the hard part about the syllabus that we develop. Like right now I'm developing for the fall. There's going to be a lot of things actually they're going to change between now and the fall for some of the classes. Like we might make some tweaks and changes to some of the syllabus between now and, September. So that's the only thing that sometimes it might get tweaked, but the general big pieces you can see in the syllabus. You'll kind of know what to expect for the most part. And also, this has happened to me. I get emails from students. Like I got an email this week from someone that's taken one of my classes in the summer. You can email the professor, like say you're looking at the summer and you want to know more about an assignment in the summer. You can email them and they'll give you some information about it. The whole faculty is really open to, helping as much as we can.
Hey, Joanne, one thing to add on to what Dr. Bedard said was what I've noticed as a difference is if you take a Saturday class, you're either on an A schedule or a B schedule. And so it's every other week. When you take a class that's during the week, it is literally every week. I have a Wednesday class and it's every week. And it goes from 6:30 until whatever, 10. It is so long. So just FYI on that piece.
That's the old school. That's pre-COVID. That's where all our classes were like that back then.
Oh my gosh. And in that class, she's making us take it in person. She might be reaching out to you, Dr. Bedard. It's Gilmore, because she asked for your name. And I said, he posts his on there. He gives us a few days, yakety yak. And she goes, oh, what's his name? I think she's new at learning how to use Moodle and she doesn't know how to post it. So she might be in touch with you.
Yeah. I've always used the Class Marker website because I've got all my exams on there. It's just easier.
That's what she does, but she doesn't know how to, anyway. She'll contact you.
Yeah. This is all new. So post-COVID, there's going to be a lot of things that'll be different, but yeah, pretty much every class back then was on person, one in person, one online. Now it's going to be different now moving forward, but I like teaching on Saturdays personally. I like it.
Can you explain that whole A-B thing on Saturday?
So let's say this class, right? So lifespan development is a Saturday A class, let's say. So we would start on the first Saturday would be the very first Saturday of the semester. And then you would only come 5 Saturdays every other Saturday from that point on. But let's say this class was a B class, you wouldn't come the first Saturday of the semester, you'd come the second Saturday and then every other Saturday until the end of the semester. That's kind of how it works.
And the syllabus and the professor is very clear on that. You're not confused like, oh, when do I go? It says it in the syllabus and it tells you when to show up. That is like sweet. I mean,
yeah. And we've definitely had people show up on the wrong Saturdays, but it happens every once in a while. But I think there'll probably be more. Well, I don't know. I think that what we do now in terms of some online and some in person might pretty much stay the same, I bet, as it has been. That's what I'm thinking, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what will happen.
How long are the Saturday classes if you're only going half the time though?
So typically it's from 8:30 until noon or something like that.
Then why during the week is it the same amount of time, but every week?
Exactly. That's my point, Joanne. It's torture.
Well, it's not necessarily the same because you also give assignments on the off weeks that are a little bit more intense in structure. And so the weekly classes are usually you're not as assignment heavy as you are on a Saturday class, most typically. Depends on the professor.
My Wednesday class is just as intensive as this and any other Saturday class I've had. Anyway.
What class is it, Donna?
It's what is that class called? Theories and Methods in Counseling with Gilmore. But she really does care and she's really awesome, but it is a lot.
Yeah. Anybody else? Everybody's sticking around. I got 5 people left. I ran everybody else off.
I'm curious if there has been any studies. So we know that the brain in adolescence goes through all these massive changes and between risk taking and judgment control and everything else. And the fact that if our parents say something, the child is not going to listen, but yet if they hear it from someplace else, they're more apt to listen. Why aren't we teaching kids more about themselves at a younger age, not just sex, but about their brain. So they're not so hard on themselves, and to make their transition easier where they can actually be an active participant in it. And I'm just curious if there's been any studies like telling them about this is what you're going to be going through, not just physically, but this is your brain. So if if you experience this, this is what's going to happen, and maybe even bring in the parents to, let them, see the course material. So if the kids have questions, I would just love to see a long-term study to see, were these kids healthier adults?
Yeah, I don't know any studies like that. I don't know that there haven't been things like that. There's probably been some maybe classes like that. I think the hard part about that would be that the hard part about adolescents is they also don't respond well to lecture either. So it would have to be super creative, which it could be. I don't know. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I can't think of anything off the top of my head research wise about something like that. I think that it's helpful for parents to know that information, but even telling them doesn't always mean that things go smoothly. Right. So the hard part about what you're saying to me is that their brains are almost developed in a way that they wouldn't listen to that either, to a certain extent, unless they discover it on their own. Now, here's the thing about our world right now. One of to me, the probably the biggest difference. We have more availability and more ability to get any information we want right now than ever before. Our problem is not information, right? In our world, our problem is not information. We have information overload. We have tons of information. We have more information now than we could ever imagine. I think the issue to me is not really the information, it's the critical thinking aspects of what we're taking in or not taking in. But I'm not saying what you're saying is a bad idea. I think that there's lots of things that can be done better for sure to help people to understand. It just seems like those types of things are better done with adults to help them understand, I would say. Because telling a kid, hey, this is the changes your brain's going through, they're like, hey, okay, that's great. Not that it wouldn't be good for them to know, but then they might also turn around and use it as, an excuse for, oh, my brain's just like my son has ADHD, and there's more than one time he'll say, well, that's my ADHD. And I'm like, oh, hang on a second. That's not, you just did this. That doesn't have anything to do with it, kind of thing. So I don't think it's a bad idea. And I don't know of any studies. That'd be kind of like a longitudinal kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because we do know certain things work with adolescents now anyway. And I didn't talk about this as much during the class, but I think the more non-judgmental we can interact, if we can be non-judgmental with how we interact with them, the better chance we have of helping them. Because they have judgment around them all the time, especially from their peers. They don't have a lot of non-judgmentalness in their life. I think that might be one of the most powerful parts of trying to help. And I'm talking about that clinically, clinically speaking, that's a tool that we can use that can really be helpful and powerful with kids. So that probably doesn't answer your question, but it's a good question.
So how does trauma affect? So a child in adolescence or different times of development, severe trauma affects them.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
Do they get stunted in that spot literally, and they don't mature?
So trauma obviously affects different people in different ways, and it depends on the trauma. But in general, trauma, depending on the trauma, but Trauma has this ability and the effect on a human being to trap the emotion trap the emotion at the event while we physically move forward, but the emotion is trapped. And when we get re-traumatized or we continue to have trouble and struggle, it's the emotion that's still there that stops us, and it can actually change the structure of the brain. Trauma can do that to people, and so trauma care a lot. And again, this is like super broad, but trauma care is allowing people to emotionally catch up to themselves and realize that we're in the present, we're not still in the, unless you're reliving unless you're still in a trauma, right? Like that's why COVID is so difficult, because COVID was like a long, like we were in a trauma for a long, long time, and it's hard to know when we're out of it. So if you live in a trauma that you're not sure you're out of yet, that's another confounding factor in trauma. But once you get out of it and you've moved forward time-wise, chronologically, the emotion a lot of times stays there. And that's the hardest part about trauma, is helping them continue to feel the emotion and and also realize that they're not back at the trauma. That's what's so hard about it. Right. So for example, if you have, if you were abused when you were young, and you get into a situation where you're in a relationship and that person raises their voice, it's like, damn, I'm back here. Well, you're not back there, but you're emotionally back there, right? Your emotions are there. You're not there. So, but I got to bring those emotions forward. That doesn't mean we should just do whatever we want, but we got to bring those emotions forward so that the whole person now is forward. And they can then go, wait a minute, they're just raising their voice. I'm not actually, what's going, you know what I mean? Like what's happening? I can handle this because I know where I'm at now. And you have to really focus on the building the levels of resilience, because people that go through trauma are some of the most resilient people that are around. Same thing with people that go through any kind of addiction. They're extremely resilient because they've learned how to cope. They learn how to cope in tremendous ways, and because they had to, or they chose to. So anyway, that's a long answer to a short question, but yeah, trauma is a large issue, and you guys should definitely take the class, the trauma class. I think Dr. Milliken teaches it. It's a really good class, because trauma is just our world. I mean, in the clinical world, we deal with trauma all the time.
Can I ask a quick question about I saw a message about the CACREP. Am I saying that right? CACREP, the accreditation, and how maybe it can affect it seems like, as I've researched it, that we'll still be fine. We just won't be able to have these letters after our name, but we'll still be able to take the test. So we'll still be able to be licensed as an LPC in Texas. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that won't affect you guys.
I just hadn't heard it from an actual professor, so I just wanted to confirm that everything's good.
Yeah, it's not going to affect, I don't think it's going to affect you guys at all.
Okay.
There's only a few CACREP programs in Texas. So yeah, that if the only time it maybe potentially could affect anyone is if you move somewhere.
Sure.
And in that part of the license, you had to have needed a CACREP university, but that's only, I think the CACREP itself doesn't even take effect until 2024 or something.
Okay.
So, but it's not going to affect you guys.
Okay, great. I just wanted to.
Yeah.
So when you were saying you don't have the letters after your name, so like that, what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, there's some extra thing that comes if you take for national certified counselors, right? I think would it be, I don't know what the extra letters are, but some LPCs have some additional letters that we maybe won't be able to have because we won't, well, you may be able to. I won't be able to take my exam before December 23. If you can take your NCE exam before December 23, then I think it wouldn't apply to you.
Oh, yeah, no,
I'm
there's
sorry.
no way I'll be able to do it.
Yeah.
By
But I
then.
think
I
it's
don't-
still fine. I still think
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. That's what he's saying is what everyone else has said,
And
that
that,
it's,
and that is true because Dr. Gilmore, who teaches that other class I was telling you about, she actually covers a lot of information on what to expect on the exam. And she'll go pull in of their information, and she talked about that. Her husband is in this, and the K-CREP thing, they have it over at, is Liberty, is there a school called Liberty University?
Yeah,
Or something?
yeah.
Okay, her husband, and it's that K-CREP thing is in there, but she said it's not required and it's not here. And I think it has something to do with like multicultural diversity, blah, 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 stuff in there, like a lot more of that, I think.
The K-CREP process is trying to get a more regulated process across the country in terms of exam and licensure. It doesn't, so that's the reason why that's happening. So it's not just about one particular issue per se, as much as about trying to make sure that basically every state has its own process, right? So every state has its own license process. This is an attempt to more regulate that process across states so that your education basically is the same in every state. Obviously, like certain states have certain things you'll take, like in Texas, you might take certain things because our state said, hey, you need to take these things because it affects our state more than maybe Illinois. But in general, the K-CREP, the process of K-CREP is trying to make it more, a little bit more uniform across. So that if you took the exam, the national license exam, it would be basically the same. You would take the same kind of, you would have the same kind of information. It's the same thing like in the LMFT world. So I went to a COAMFTA accredited school. So COAMFTA means all the schools that are COAMFTA, just like if they were K-CREP, would all be the same. Basically teach the same curriculum, same everything, right? So that's what that's about. And Amerton has chosen not to pursue that right now. And it won't affect you guys. You can still be LPCs or LMFTs or whatever you're going to be. It's not going to really affect you. And it shouldn't affect you on the exam either.
Right.
Everything you do, our exam, I think our pass rate at Amerton is like in the high 90s. We have the first or second highest exam rate passing percentage in the country, in the state. So you'll learn everything you'll need to know. You'll be fine. So it's a good question though. That K-CREP stuff comes up every once in a while, and I can't keep up with all of it. I don't know. I'm not always aware of, when things are happening or not, but the other professor that knows a lot about it is Dr. Armstrong, because he kind of looked into it a little more closely. And so he would have a lot of information about it too.
Thank you.
All right.
so
Hey,
much for
appreciate it.
spending extra time.
You
Have a
bet.
good weekend.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
You guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I know.